There's a system running in the background of every multiplayer game that you play, and it decides whether you have a good night or a bad one. The people complaining the loudest about it on X and Reddit are usually wrong about how it works, and the people running studios that depend on it usually don't know much either. This is the season the matchmaking argument is finally getting taken seriously. Call of Duty just walked back the biggest matchmaking change in their history. They tried open lobbies for a few months. People hated it more than skills based matchmaking did. Activision themselves recently went public with internal white papers explaining parts of how their system actually works, which is rare for an industry that usually treats this stuff as proprietary. There is real movement here, and that's worth understanding what's actually being argued about. Today's guest is Charlie Olson. He helped architect the matchmaking rating system for Call of Duty back in 2015. The system he helped build is still running, essentially unchanged, in every mainline release since. There are a handful of people in the world who can speak about how the system works from the inside, and he's one of them. Lewis Ward is co-hosting this one with me. He brought the technical questions, I brought the game-related one. Charlie didn't hold back. Let's get into it. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today. You want to do a little introduction?
Yeah, so I got my background in medical imaging, actually. I started doing engineering for a medical imaging company, and then I ended up going into games, which had always been my dream job. And I think everybody in computer science always wanted to go into games, but I worked on Wolfenstein 2009 back at Raven. That was my first, well, in Singularity also. So I did the player movement, weapons, general gameplay programming, some tech rendering program too. But then I dabbled in conventional software development for a few years, then came back to games to work at Activision. That's basically how I got my start.
So can you kind of explain what your role was in the Call of Duty franchise, and can you highlight how it's connected to what you're doing at Invokation Games and why you're doing it today?
Well, I spent quite a few years at Activision, but when I came back, I worked on COD Online, which was only released in China. So this was the PC free-to-play, the first like COD free-to-play title, doing tech programming initially, and then branched into analytics, like some weapon balance related analytics, cosmetics, and in-game economy stuff. But Tencent was really adamant about having skill-based matchmaking, which is not something that, like, COD had some systems for this, but didn't have a really like strong MMR system. So I just kind of got that thrown on my plate and figured some things out. And after that, it ended up, we took on Modern Warfare Remastered. I don't know if you remember the Infinite Warfare, Modern Warfare Remaster era. But that MMR system I developed for COD Online then ended up getting pulled into MWR and Infinite Warfare and like all the mainline CODs after that. So I kind of ended up doing skill and analytics and getting away from tech programming and more into this other stuff. So I ended up also designing like the ELO system for World War II ranked play. And if you're a hardcore player, you might know like the dynamic aim response curve on controller. I actually did that for COD World War II for the PC SKU. And then it ended up finally making it into a mainline game with, I think, MW 2019, like 3 years later, Infinity Ward adopted it. So a lot of different hats there, but eventually converging on analytics and math and tech programming.
Before we dive too deep into it, can you tell us exactly what MMR is and how it relates to skills-based matchmaking? And what is Demonware and how does that relate to skills-based matchmaking?
Sure. So MMR is the matchmaking rating. So that's the number that you use for finding players of comparable skill, or if you're doing team balancing, like that would be the number you try to get to line up with the other team to get a symmetrical team. Demonware is kind of a sort of a support studio. They just handle all the back-end services for every COD title. I think Activision acquired them back in like the mid 2000s. So they've been doing the back end, which includes matchmaking, and they might be doing player data, but like server orchestration, all the behind the scenes stuff is done from Demonware, either in Dublin, the Ireland location, or in Vancouver, over in Canada.
Before we jump into the white paper specifics, I have this kind of thesis around how matchmaking fits into the broader fabric of a game, if you will. And this is hopefully something that applies to many games. And if I'm wrong, just correct me if I'm wrong. But this is the way I'm thinking about it, is there's a moment-to-moment loop, right? The moment of playing the game, the feel that comes with that, the shooting, the explosions, all that stuff that most people recognize as the game you're playing, any game you're playing. Then the second one is kind of a meta loop, if you will, a secondary loop, a longer term loop, which I would put matchmaking into that in terms of a larger system you're going into. So you gain XP if you play well in a match or not, or your skill rating goes up and down. And of course, in COD, they have seasons. So there's like a 2-month long loop here where you might play for 2 months and then you'll see where you're at. And then you play another 2 months and you may go up or down based on your skill rating or whether you keep moving forward. So the last one, the largest term loop, is kind of your meta progression system through the entire game. So you have, I think it's levels 1 to 49 or 50, something like that. And you can kind of hit prestige if you go over that, and you keep leveling up and you can keep doing these up and down hills. That is like the entire game, your lifetime, badges, awards, everything you've gotten, your accrued, prestige skills, everything like that. That's like the largest, longest term loop, if you will. And for me, I kind of put matchmaking into that middle area of the game. That's vital because it connects the moment to moment to the meta progression coming out of it, if that makes sense. So after that long setup, my question is, if you think that's fair, usually there's an aesthetic goal in the game, something you're reaching for that's going to span the moment to moment and the matchmaking and the long-term progression system, which has to do with the genre or the type of game you're making or wanting to make and how players respond to that. And so my large question here is, what is the type of feeling or experience that not just the recent Call of Duties, but maybe going back, to your time there, or maybe even earlier, what is the type of aesthetic experience or the goal that Activision wants to generate in players as they experience this?
Well, I guess as a caveat to this, I left in mid-2020. I didn't say this in my intro, but during the first OG Warzone era. And so prior to that, as far as I know, there is not a designer that this might have changed, but in my experience, there wasn't a designer-led like aesthetic goal. Mostly it was tech-driven, like technical from Activision Central or like Central Tech and Demonware, and a few analytics teams keeping tabs on like retention metrics and engagement, things like that. But also just like basic match quality, match tightness, both in terms of skill and latency, and then like the enjoyment metric, or like what we think are player enjoyment metrics, like in-game quits, rage quits, things like that. So there might have been some input from developers, but at least on COD, it was just like a couple of us on the tech team determining how we wanted to do matchmaking or like tweaking and analyzing things. And then for mainline, it was mostly like Demonware just pushing the tech envelope, and then Central Techs or Central Analytics validating those changes.
So there really wasn't some overarching goal that was that your work was in the middle of this, moment to moment, the medium term matchmaker stuff, and then the full meta loop. There were not really discussions around what the overall goal of lining all these things up well is.
Yeah,
right? Is that what I'm hearing?
At least not like at a high level design perspective. But I would say with like the MMR system itself, which like the one that I came up with for COD Online, that was specifically designed for persistent lobbies, like for rebalancing teams in between matches. So like that was the primary goal, was just like, how can we rebalance these lobbies fairly in between games, where there are other systems like Microsoft TrueSkill at the time that adapt very slowly. So you basically get the same teams match to match with a persistent lobby. And when they're obviously unbalanced, that's not a good experience for players. So the extent of an aesthetic goal was just like, how can we get fair matches or fair team balance in consecutive matches in a persistent lobby? We could talk a little bit about the matchmaker itself, how that changed from like back in, what was it, Infinite Warfare? I think that's 2016, like going to a centralized matchmaker. So now you have a little more control over how matches are created. And then going up to Modern Warfare 2019, which is what most players identify as like when they think matchmaking got cranked up or, you know, something dramatically changed. But the real change there was for all the playlists. Like they added a lot more game modes and they added a lot more dedicated servers. And so these disbanding lobbies, that had to get introduced in order to get more players on more servers.
So, okay, that's great. And that's helpful in terms of my next question, Charlie, which is kind of about the white paper from the middle of 2024. The focus from Activision Blizzard or Activision Publishing in that paper was team deathmatch, so the 6v6 firefights. And they were kind of specifically looking at the role of skill in matchmaking, which is why you're the perfect guy for this talk. You know, they did something called a deprioritization of skill test. I will call it a DST for short. So in the deprioritization of skill test, they basically loosened the skill parameters in matchmaking so that there was a wider range of skill players in each lobby, which had certain effects on the game that we'll get to. But anyway, that's the larger context of this white paper. They were assessing how this A/B tests work in effect. And they did highlight in there early on that there's two other factors besides skill, which are truly important, which is ping or latency. So one thing you got to make sure you get right is whoever's in the match, they want to have low latency. If you're bad at that and they have low latency, they'll quit the match. The other one is time to match. If they're waiting in lobbies for a long period of time, they will also quit the game. And I think you might have mentioned that you know, there was some rework done here that maybe improved both those things because they had a lot of servers. But the point I really want to make is that, you know, in this white paper, which came out in 2024, the focus was Modern Warfare 3. That was the specific game where they kind of dive into it in significant depth on TDM. Is that my point is that the vital and scarce resource, once you get beyond ping and time to match, is skill. And if you look at it as a marketplace, that is the commodity, the thing that's being traded in a market that's being managed by Activision. And that's what your team did, was basically, you know, and it was Treyarch, Infinity Ward, Sledgehammer, Demonware, whatever, is that they were in effect in the position of creating a market where different player groups would come together in these matches and they would fight it out. And I guess my question is, you know, does that make sense to you? That did you feel at the time, or does it make sense to you that, you know, that's what part of your role was, is to kind of set up a market where skill is the scarce commodity that's being managed, and it's your goal to use that resource to its best advantage for the players and for the company?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that skill was the resource or like the commodity being traded. Like if I was going to make that analogy in a way, I'm not sure I would make this analogy either, but closest you could get would be like dopamine or like dominance, like your chance at being the top of the leaderboard, that gets distributed by the skill-based matchmaking. Like, and that's a transparent objective of it, is to give everybody a shot at performing better in a match instead of always getting stomped. So if we're talking about like a zero sum though, then you could think about the team balancer as zero sum. So like skill, yes, we're trying to put even amounts of skill on both teams to make them a fair match. But even that has nuance to it. So we could probably go into that a little bit later, but I guess long story short, so yeah, maybe it's like dopamine or that chance to dominate a lobby that gets distributed, but
right.
It's not
I guess
exactly
that's fair. And maybe that goes back to my aesthetic point. Your goal is dopamine, or your goal is to give that feeling, that exuberance of winning the match. And that may be the goal that you're actually targeting for, the emotional response, the psychological response on the part of players. But the actual math that goes into producing that, the thing behind the scenes isn't dopamine, it's a skill number and your goal is to match teams closely in that skill rating. And when they're not matched, you get blowouts and whatnot. We'll get to that. But I guess my point would be that, you know, as the market maker, if you will, your goal, Activision's goal, Demonware's goal was to, you know, have those skills be in narrow ranges so that there was a possibility of a very exciting finish to the match.
When you look at a game like Team Deathmatch or a mode like Team Deathmatch, right? When you look at the bottom 5%, there's probably a giant pool of people there. In the top 5%, it's less of a pool. So does something happen different there to make it more fair? How do the skilled players always subsidize or carry the lowest skilled players on their team when that happens? How does that balancing work?
It depends on if you're talking about the team balancer or the matchmaker itself. So with Activision, with Call of Duty's matchmaker, they do the team balancing as a last step. Like they try to put the players together into a match, and then with whatever they have to work with, then they sort them into teams. So then you do have that like case where you'll get the highest skilled and the lowest skilled player generally will be on the same team together, and everybody else in the middle is on the other team. But that's only one way to do it. When it comes to the matchmaker itself, I think maybe we'll go into more detail later. But just as like a quick overview, they don't do a great job of accounting for those extremes. Like the bottom 5% of players, I think, perform worse than you would ideally want them to perform. Like there is room for improvement there. I mean, there's a lot of complexity to that discussion. Like, how do you make that bottom 5% perform better? Is it tighter matches, or do you start injecting bots like in China, like in Tencent or COD Online's case? Like having bots in matches is totally acceptable. For Western audiences, it's generally frowned upon, but I would say bots are the way to treat the bottom 5% if you want to improve that, or just tighter matchmaking. And then at the high skills, I think you want to be careful not to drag them down too far, because they're already giving up some of their enjoyment so other people can enjoy the game more. And, that has to be balanced out.
So just kind of, I'm going to make it simpler for me to understand. The way Call of Duty, you're saying, does it right now is basically they'll close their eyes, they'll pull out 40 random players and then take a look at the rankings of each of those players and say, all right, let's split them up evenly to make this a fair match. But they're given their hand, they're dealt their hand, and they got to work with that.
Yeah, they're not quite random. Like they're the way their matchmaker works, and they talk about this in one of the matchmaking papers, is if they have a party, say with big disparity in it, then they're going to try to find people who are close to the middle of that party. I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate. I think they might skew towards the higher MMR of the party. But either way, they're not trying to match the composition of the party. They're just trying to match that average. And then once they've got a bunch of players who are roughly in the same ballpark of skill, then they'll sort them into teams. And that's why you end up with those kind of asymmetrical team shapes. The median players, or the middle skill players, and then the extreme players on the other team.
Yeah, and just to kind of underscore that point, which I think you mentioned earlier, if you're, maybe this is oversimplifying it, but let's say they're both 90% skill. That the target match is like a 90 skill rating or whatever it is, toward the high end, at the 90th percentile. You've got some player that's a 95, you got some player that's an 85th percentile on the same team, so that they balance out to 90, and the other group is all around 90, something like that. But in that individual case, that highest skilled player is essentially carrying or subsidizing the amount of skill that the lowest team player has in order to match it at 90. And I just want to make sure that sense, generally speaking, is the goal up and down the entire system, from the bottom 5 and 10% to the top 5 or 10%. The goal is to match the skill ratings, sum them, and get to a similar number across all 6 players in this case. But in that case, every single best player on a team is very likely going to be carrying somebody who's relatively lower skilled, and that's just built into the way the system works. Or is that not fair, that there's kind of a subsidy system going on for skill?
It's accurate, but it's not the goal. It's what happens with COD's team balancer, but it's not necessarily what they want to happen. So they do want to have even teams, but to have make it more extreme, say like a 90 and a 10% on a team together, and then they're going to play against 2 50s. So that averages out. But that's just a consequence of doing the team balancing last, versus ideally what you would want is a 90 with a matching 90 on the other team. And if you had an extreme, like a 10%, you want a 10% on the other team. So then it's balanced in terms of the average and total skill, but it's also balanced in terms of the standard deviation. So that's how that's how I prefer to match teams, is with moment matching. So that was one of the things, like one of the reasons for building our own matchmakers, so that we could do this like moment matching between teams and not just matching the means or the sums.
If you have that 90-10 team and that 50-50 team, who's likely to win?
Probably the 50-50. It depends a bit on it's hard to say exactly how accurate the MMR model is, but in most cases, I would see like the 50-50 are either able to like ignore the 10% player and overwhelm the 90%, but it depends on the game, really. Either way, it's not a match you really like to make. You could do it once in a while because it's interesting, but it's not something you want to do regularly.
I'm wondering how I talked about early the immediate moment to moment in the match, the matchmaking system and the seasonal thing, and then the large scale progression system. And here's a question relating, I guess, that medium tier part of what you've done to the larger system, which is the largest or longest term system. Is, do you know how skill or post match MMR outcomes and its hidden recalculations, because you don't see in the casual portion of the COD player base, you don't know your MMR, but do you know how it relates to the XP points you get at the end of a match? So in other words, if you play really well, is it true that your XP would be relatively high even if your team loses, and vice versa? Or can you give me any color on how the bonus coming out of the post-match experience connects to the MMR and the skill you showed in a given match?
Yeah, as far as I know, it has zero connection.
Oh, okay.
Other than your match is a little more difficult if you are a higher MMR player. To really dominate a high MMR match is increasingly unusual, versus if you tried to smurf, and then you would have more chance at being the best player in a lobby as a smurf. But I think it should be connected. I mean, that's kind of the going back to the overall design. It is something that makes sense to reward players for skill, especially if it's going to be like a hidden number that affects their matchmaking experience, but they get no perk for having a higher skill. That's just unfair.
So there is no connection, as far as you know, between if you just finish a round, you're going to get a certain amount of XP. You might not get some of the other accolades or bonuses or badges or other things that go with playing well, kill streaks, whatever it may be, no deaths, those sorts of things. But in terms of the XP payout that accrues to your total long-term XP as you grind up through these levels in COD, as far as you know, at least while you were there was no relationship that a good player would get 10% more XP than that if we went to 90-10, that the 90 person on the team would get high XP, the 10 would get lower. No.
Correct. I mean, your XP is independent of the MMR behind it. There's not the MMR is strictly for matchmaking, not for the game economy. But I think it could be it makes sense to incorporate skill. You have that number, and if it's a reliable number, why not use it?
Taking it a little lighter here for a moment. Charlie, what's your favorite game of all time, and why do you remember loving it?
If we're going all time, it's probably the old OG King's Quest games, the early ones, maybe Space Quest 3, way back in the 80s.
Is that Sierra?
Yeah, is it 80s? Maybe even early 90s. More recent, I would say Bloodborne, if it was 60 frames per second, would be my favorite game, at least single player. And then I guess the game I play the most has got to be Street Fighter 6 now, but that's a love-hate thing. I don't think there's so many things that could be better in that game, but I also I hate playing it, but I also love playing it. And it's just a pure competitive game. So
I love it. Those true love games when you hate it, but you just can't stop playing it. It's got that hook on you.
It's like a bad relationship. Okay, I'm gonna punish you again by going back into the white paper. All right. So there were in this deprioritization of skill tests, they had blowouts in the deprioritized part of the sample had more blowouts, meaning that the team in a lobby won with a score delta more than 30. That was how they defined a blowout. But basically, one of the quotes in the white paper is that those blowouts had increased for all players and has also been established as having a negative correlation with self-reported fun. So basically they were saying, and there's a figure of this, that blowouts were 12% more likely across all 10 skill deciles. So they have a figure of it. They broke out all the players in the deep prize skill test. And in effect, the against the control group, the blowouts were 12% more likely in those across all of those deciles once they deprioritize skill. And so my question for you is, can you talk about the relationship between blowouts and player fun? Why do these things negatively relate?
Well, I think there's, to the extent that there's, the blowouts are not that rewarding to a high skill player, it's only because it's like, you know, the football analogy or soccer analogy of like, if you have pro players and they're beating up on a group of kids, like that's not that, there's no honor in that, or there's nothing rewarding about it. But it has to be a pretty extreme blowout to get to those diminishing returns. Like you do like to have a match where your team just dominates and you have a great stat sheet and, you know, that kind of outlier. But I think the blowouts are really more of a correlation. Like everything I've looked at seems to indicate more that it's individual performance that players really care about. And it's just the blowouts are correlated with that. So if you're on a team that gets destroyed, you're just more unlikely to have had a underwhelming personal performance yourself. Whereas if your team is on the other side of that, or on, at least in a more even match, then you have a higher chance of being the best player in the lobby or having like a great personal performance. So maybe it's a little like cynical, but I think it's really about individual performance for most of those cases. And then in the cases where it's just like such an extreme blowout, it's just not fun for intuitive reasons.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in addition to the near term or the immediate impact of more blowouts and being less fun, which makes a lot of sense, I'd like to turn to like a longer term effect that came out of the deprioritization of skill tests. I'll give you a couple quotes here and then ask you a question. So the quote was, "We have historically found that in-match quit rates have a strong negative correlation with self-reported fun gathered through player surveys." They also said, when skill is utilized in matchmaking, 80 to 90% of players experience better end-of-match placement, stick with the game longer, and quit matches less frequently. And last, if low skill players engage with our titles less, then higher skilled players become the new low skilled players, relatively speaking. As a result, that they experience the negative outcomes of being the lowest skilled players and more of the multiplayer population, likely resulting in reduced return rates. It becomes a negative feedback loop. So this is kind of like a longer term thing, which I thought was super interesting, is that if you keep adding up blowouts after blowouts, in effect, the entire base starts to shrink, or in a relative sense, the number of players goes down because it's less fun. They experience it multiple times and then they quit. But my question is, you know, what are the negative long-term impacts of deprioritization of skill? And this is COD, but I think it extends to many different types of games. So it may not be just relation to COD, but other things you've done, competitive shooters or other types of games. But in your experience, I guess, do you think it's generally true that if skill is loose enough and the matches become unbalanced enough, that it eventually starts killing the entire community? Or is that not fair?
I think that's true. And as far as I know, every game that's looked at it has seen the same thing. Like Apex has gone into this in a few presentations and papers, and Fortnite obviously has skill-based matchmaking. And pretty much every game that's tried skill-based matchmaking versus like a deprioritized skill has seen that skill helps in all these KPI that they're after. But I think maybe PUBG is a notable exception to that, because that's like, that audience is very baked in. Like and as far as I know, they don't have skill-based matchmaking. Like it's really purely random, and they have a player base that expects that and wants that. But it depends on who you're catering to as well. Like COD is actually a very casual audience, contrary to like the most vocal critics, influencers are not casual themselves, like they've been playing it for decades now, they tend to be a little more, I guess, affected by skill-based matchmaking and more outspoken against it. But the bulk of the audience really would fall off. Like you would have that cascade effect with the lower skill players. Like it is people who just play 2 hours a day and don't really care about getting better. Like they're not there to compete in esports. They just want to go pick up a controller, get into kind of a flow state, grind a few weapon camos, unlock some content, and then that's it. That's what they want out of the game. They don't want to go in there and have it be like a hardcore experience where they have to like train and learn things just to be able to compete. So depends on the game, but I think most mass market like AAA games have seen exactly that sort of cascade effect where you have the low skill players start falling off faster, and then that pulls the next decile with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's cool. That's a good explanation. Interesting that PUBG is a little different. There was another couple quotes from the same white paper, if I may, that has to deal with the top versus 10% skill players. So the high skill versus low skill. There was a difference here that I'd like to call out and see what you make of it. But the quote from the white paper was, with deprioritized skill, returning player rate was down significantly for 90% of players. The 10% highest skilled players came back in increased numbers, but in aggregate, we see meaningfully fewer players coming back to the game. And also they have a figure of this. Kills per minute is down significantly for the bottom 20 to 30% of players. The next 60% of players had no significant change, and the top 10% had significantly higher KPMs. And then they flipped it around. We also tightened skill in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. They had inverse results consistent with the results of the loosening test. The quit rate was down for 90% of players, and we saw other improvements in skill players. So basically, the interesting thing for me out of this was that there's a difference happening within the player group. The top 10% liked it more. When you depry it, the top 10% are on the winning side of those blowouts, and they actually come back more. They have higher KD ratios and all these things. They're eating popcorn, drinking beer, whatever it is, having a blast. But the bottom 20, 30% is where you're really losing them, right? That's where they're getting blown out all the time, getting stomped into the mud every other match. And so they're the ones that really lose. And so the net effect is negative. And so, I guess, my question for you is basically the deep price skill test was negative near term and long term, but in the near term, high skilled players liked it, which means that Activision, as the market regulator, can choose the KPI that they're trying to optimize for. They could change the skill system in a way that delivers a KPI. Maybe it's DAO, total hours played, spending on CP, whatever it is. And so they could choose how much to depry or what they want to do in the top versus bottom of the player base. And they can optimize around a KPI, if I'm getting that system right. And, do you agree with that viewpoint that they can mess with the skill in the range of skill to optimize for a different KPI than skill itself, if that's what they're trying to optimize?
To manipulate the KPI or to optimize that KPI, like they have limited levers. Like skill is like the matchmaking. I guess to clarify, like the matchmaking behavior itself, like how tight the matches are, and then behavior of the MMR system, like how fast ratings change, or like if they they react wildly, like overreact in the case of COD, where you get this kind of whiplash effect. Like that is something they can tweak a little bit. So they have these kind of crude levers. But as far as like targeting like the different groups, like when they only have a couple of levers, like there's only so much they can do to make everybody happy. And I think there is, there's quite a bit of nuance there. Like if we have time, maybe we'll go into some of those details of what like the finer tuning adjustments could be. But Activision, indeed, like they do choose these KPIs. So the thing I wanted to say about or kind of like made me think of when you're talking about this, is that they optimize for KPI, but the KPI are like a proxy for what they really want, which is long-term revenue, and they want long-term retention. So players keep coming back and buying the game, and then also playing the game for months at a time so that they can buy more MTX and optimize for revenue basically. But the KPI they use are just short-term observable things that they can study in like a 2-week time span, and they're just making an assumption that this correlates to long-term health of the game, and it might not. Like, they could be wrong about that assumption. Engagement, like, that does not equal fun. Like, we know that, like, if you're playing, like, a lot of mobile games are engaging, but are they fun, or are they just like getting you hooked? Or trying to squeeze engagement out of players is maybe not the best tactic. Like, this could be counterproductive in the long term if they're just trying to like maximize their engagement KPI. Likewise, ignoring the sort of like soft data, like player complaints. I mean, I know skill-based matchmaking gets tons of negative sentiment every release, every COD cycle, but ignoring that is maybe also not a great strategy. Like, you let that negative sentiment just kind of build up and foment, and I think that, you know, that snowballs maybe slowly, but it builds up. You know, the flip side of that is people will then jump in and say, well, you just got to get rid of skill-based matchmaking altogether. And that's not necessarily a good solution either. That's just the obvious solution if it negatively affects you as a player. It's like, well, we have to get rid of this. But long story short, yeah, they do choose the KPI. They might be measuring just what they can see and kind of ignoring these longer term trends at their own peril. But I don't think it's as extreme as some of the players would argue with Black Ops 7. They're like, well, it sold poorly because of skill-based matchmaking. And that's not it either. It's just there's a lot of factors here. There's a lot of nuance involved. It's not, you know, Activision's not completely correct. They're not completely wrong either.
Can we do a little bit of a role play here real quick, Charlie? If we can't and we have to
Sure.
edit it
Never
out,
mind.
this is perfectly fine. But I was reading yesterday about Marvel Rivals, and people love it. But there's been so many complaints about the matchmaking in the last 2 seasons that there's a good chance that it not destroys the game, but truly impacts long-term engagement with the game. And I don't know how up to date you are on it, but if you are, can you talk about what's going on with with Marvel Rivals and matchmaking? And if you were to come in as a consultant, how would you take a look at this problem and figure out how to fix it?
As far as I know, like, their retention is pretty good though, like long term.
Yes.
So like, you want to acknowledge the player complaints, and I haven't played it, like, so this is me just talking out of uninformed nowhere. I do know they tried a couple of things. Like, they notoriously, the team behind their matchmaker published a talk on engagement optimized matchmaking. So they're trying to build a model of player engagement and then give you matches that are most likely to increase your engagement, not necessarily the most fair match or something like you would design intuitively, but something that leads towards you coming back and spending money. They have since like denied that's what's going on. So I don't really know the case, but I do know they use TrueScale under the hood, and they do have a problem of MMR not adapting quickly. So players will get pigeonholed to like a specific skill level, and then they'll just keep getting matched over and over as though they're that skill, even though they might be having a good day or a bad day. Like, the reason we, in COD Online, we deliberately designed the MMR system to rebalance the teams quickly. But I think if you're using TrueScale, you would not have that effect. So that could be one of the things that's going on. And then the other thing is, it's just hard when you have like a role-based game where it matters what character you choose and who your teammates choose. Like, that really makes matchmaking complicated. So could be they just haven't figured out the right approach to matchmaking there.
That's true. That's a whole nother caveat in that, hey, we get dealt a random deck of cards, and then all of a sudden you don't know what players' characters are going to select, and that's just going to alter everything, right? So that's a whole nother stick in the side, I guess.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess, going back to the, the 10% versus bottom percent in COD, if I can for a second. You said you might suggest a certain optimization that could be done. I don't know if you had a something in mind there, but I'd be interested in hearing, what your assessment is that could help improve that, if you've got one handy.
There's a few, like we talked about the team balancing for one thing, of like trying to build symmetrical teams, but specifically looking at the normalized scoreboard position is basically what this graph is, where they're showing like the bottom decile players generally ends up towards the bottom half of the match. And then the top decile, they are almost always in the top half of the match. So it's normalized scoreboard position based on net kills, I think is exactly what they're using there. And it is very low for that bottom decile. So what I would actually like to see is a more linear increase. So it'd be really nice to have a visual here if we pull up the paper itself. But they tend to have a inverted S curve, like inverted sigmoid. So there's this plateau in the middle where it's the 20th percentile through 50th or 60th percentile don't have an appreciable change in their outcomes despite having higher skill. And this is going to be a bad player experience. Like, this is something that people complain about and rightfully complain about, that every match feels the same if you're in that range where, yeah, you get matched with somebody of your skill. So what's the point of like learning the maps better or tweaking your loadouts to have a better performance? Like, you want an appreciable change in your average outcome if you actually improve. So instead of that flat, you don't want that plateau in the middle. You want that to be linear. And I think a big reason that plateau happens, to answer your question, your initial question, is because they use percentile-based matchmaking. Part of it is the matchmaking might be a little bit too loose, but I think a bigger part is because they match players based on percentile, not based on MMR, not based on the skill number itself. So when you're in this range where most players are, you get matched too tightly in a way. And what they actually need is deliberately looser matchmaking for the middle tier players so that they can feel this improvement over time.
Yeah, it's like a psychological impact rather than anything else. And another thing you mentioned in there that I just hit on quickly was that some people just want SBMM ripped out of it, which is like a giant deep prize skill test. Unless I'm wrong, they basically get rid of the whole thing, in which case the player base would quickly fall to zero. Isn't that the point of this white paper? Is Activision was saying, if we do this, we're in more trouble than if we don't.
Well, I don't think it would fall to zero. You would weed out all of the casual players, and you'd end up with just like in Black Ops 7, like when they went to the it's not deprioritized skill completely, but it's weaker skill-based matchmaking, and you do end up with the more like hardcore stable players. So like retention looks great, but it's because you've already filtered out all of the casual players who would stick around longer. So yeah, I don't think it goes to zero, but it's also an easy suggestion to make if it benefits you. Like if you're in the top 10% players by skill, like, yeah, get rid of skill-based matchmaking. And you think, of course, this is great for me. It must be great for everybody. But in fact, it's not good for the long-term health of the game.
They also had in the same figure, and maybe we'll bring it up in the podcast, but basically they have a hypothetical max skill matching title where every player decile had a 50-50 win rate from top to bottom. Now they don't do that. The actual game itself had this kind of gradient where the lower you were, the more like you were to lose a match, and then the top share, top 10%, even top 20, 30% was kind of above water on winning those. So Activision knows, or they could theoretically in the SBMM get to a place where all 10 deciles have 50-50 win rates and basically mandate 50-50 losses and get rid of the or make all deciles equal on skill matching. And I guess the question is, they don't do it, and the question is, why don't they want that? Why wouldn't be enforcing in the top and bottom percent a 50% win rate a good thing? Because they don't go there, but they could.
Yeah, I think, well, coming back to the previous question, I don't think that's a good player experience, because you it would be fine in ranked play where you have visible feedback about your skill rating and you expect to have a perfectly even match. But if you're expecting to feel your improvement over time, like, that completely eliminates it. So just from a design perspective, I don't think that's what you want in casual. You do want like a softer, linear increase over time. The other part to it is I don't think they can do it. Like, technically within their acceptable time to match, like the acceptable wait time and the way the matchmaker works, like they just can't get matches tighter than what they currently are, or they would. But again, I think it ultimately comes back to possibly the percentile-based matchmaking is kind of distorting that middle player experience. So if I could change one thing, I would switch to MMR-based matchmaking instead of skill percentile.
So let us know what you're doing today at Invokation Games, and have you reached any conclusions about how recent or forthcoming competitive and co-op games should think about their matchmaking infrastructure? And what's the most important thing to get right in your mind in 2026?
I think, well, to talk about what we're doing at Invokation, so we started off doing just skill ratings, like just the MMR system, and have quite a few customers licensing that. So we're like a premium alternative to Microsoft TrueSkill, or ELO is the most common MMR system that people have heard of. ELO doesn't actually work. If you use it for skill-based matchmaking, it breaks down, but we have a very robust, complex skill rating system. So we started with that for a couple of years, and now we've moved into full matchmaking, and we're actually going live tonight with one game and next week with another game. The matchmaking, like I always thought that was a solved problem, but as we've been working with customers, I came to realize like this really is not solved. Like there's Flex Match from Amazon out there, and there's like COD's Matchmaker, and they're doing a lot of things that I thought we could do better. So we've spent the last year and a half kind of building that out, and we'll see. But so that's it. I mean, it's basically everything related to skill-based matchmaking is what Invokation does. The customers, though, I think, and I'm not going to name names. Like we do case studies, I'll talk about our customers in detail. So just very generally speaking, I think they should consider matchmaking as part of the UX. Like Lewis was saying right at the beginning, like it's part of the overall arc, and it's related to progression and economy. Like it doesn't have to be just a technical problem. This is actually a design problem. So think about the kind of matchmaking experience you want for players. And that ties into things like don't release too many game modes, because you don't want to fragment the player base so that they can't find matches in the modes they want to play. If you take away modes, they won't like that, but you can always add more modes if you have a player base that can support it. So I would say start small. Always start with like 1, 3 max game modes, just to make sure that you can matchmake that. Same thing with optimizing match quality over time to match, I think is a little bit tricky, because you actually want to, the assumption is that low skill players want to get into matches quickly. And what I've told a lot of our customers is that low skill players actually are the most fragile cohort. Like they actually want the best match quality. So don't give them matches quickly, give them the highest quality match that you can within a reasonable time period. And then other than that, just thinking about I guess having we'll just leave it at that.
I have a question going back to ELO, because you mentioned that, and I was reading something recently. I'm not a Madden NFL player, but there was at least some online references, and it might have been around their esports related stuff. So it may not be more generally, but obviously the competitive mode there, the MUT mode, is like a main competition thing. And there was a strong suggestion that it's based on some sort of ELO system. And you mentioned how, in your view, ELO, which I think there's even on like if you play chess, there's an ELO score and things like that. So I think it came out of in real life and got translated to games. But if you can double click on, you don't necessarily have to do Madden's MUT mode, but I'm curious about why you think ELO as an option is flawed in the context of, I don't know if you mean all multiplayer online games or just shooters, or where exactly the limits are. But I would love to hear a little bit more about your ELO critique.
So there's a couple issues with ELO. So it's named after Arpad Elo, who actually I think lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, back in the 60s, 70s. So it is what chess uses, and it's pretty easy to calculate update. You just have 2 ratings between 2 players, and then you can calculate if one player wins, how much ELO should they gain and how much should the other player lose. And in most scenarios, it's zero sum. But if you use it for matchmaking, the problem is it amplifies the flaws in the model when you start matching too closely together. So you have two players who are 1,000 rated and one wins and the other loses. Like you end up then matching against a player of almost exactly the same skill. And what happens is instead of making a nice stable distribution, the distribution just kind of expands over time. And you saw this even in like FIDE, like the International Chess Federation had to reset everybody's ratings according to some formula to shrink them back into an acceptable range. But inherently, there's just no global frame of reference. There's no population model in chess. It doesn't know that it's unlikely that you would actually be a 2,800 rated player versus a 1,200 rated player. So that's really the main problem with ELO is just it's unstable over the long run, but it has a lot of nice predictable properties, like when you gain like plus or minus 40 for a win, like for a evenly made match, like that's intuitive to players. They like that. I think that makes sense. So there's good things to it. You can adapt it to multiple players too. Like a lot of people think it's only made for 1v1, but as long as you can calculate an expected outcome and compare it to the actual outcome, you can do a ELO update with any number of players. There are some games that make it work. Like I'm thinking of course, Street Fighter has a pure ELO system at the very high. Once you get to master rank, they switch you to ELO. The catch is you have to reset the ratings every season, because if you don't reset the ratings, they are going to inflate, kind of expand over time. So you got to like bring everybody back into the middle of the season. But if you do that, you could use an ELO system, especially like 1v1 seasonal reset. It's not the worst, but if you're trying to have like a nice ranked experience, if you do ELO, everybody's going to start in the middle at the 50th percentile. So half of your players are going to lose rank over time, half are going to gain, and the ones losing rank are obviously not going to be thrilled about that they're just converging on a lower and lower number. So another thing to think about in the design. But I would just add quick too that IVK skill, like our MMR system, does allow you to start players anywhere in the distribution and know that they're going to converge on their actual rating. So if you want to give players like a little bit of a progression, like a skill journey, you can deliberately underrate them from where you think they're going to end up. Like we do placement matches, get a good idea of where we think you'll go, underrate you, and then you're still going to win like ELO, like plus or minus based on your competition, but you're going to plateau where you belong. So you will increase over time and then plateau once you're 50-50 win rate. So it's a long story on just a small question, but
no, that's great. No, that makes sense on the 1v1 game, including MUT for Madden makes sense. Let me go back to, you mentioned ranked play earlier, and I'd like to ask you a couple questions. We're near the end here, but this is around ranked play. The second white paper that Activision Publishing put out at the end of 2024 dealt with ranked play, where ranked your skill rating, I think it's SR, is made explicit. So every player knows where they are. And basically, to set some context, in ranked play, there is the battle royale mode, but I'm kind of ignoring that, and the white paper does too. They're looking at the 4x4 matches, which are the same thing that you do in Call of Duty League, I believe. So it's, in some senses, it's like taking a subset of the broad or casual player base. They're looking at ranked play. They put in some more anti-cheat things in there. They talk about anti-cheat in that paper. So maybe that's getting back to the point you made about you need to be more careful about how competition works at the high end of the market. But basically, in the white paper, they lay out that for ranked play, there's various tiers. I believe there's 7 tiers that go from bronze to iridescent, and they all have, that goes from 0 to 10,000 plus. So if you're in iridescent, that's like the highest tier. Small share of players fit there. That's over 10,000. But at bronze, it's like 0 to 900 is the beginning of it. And then, like I said, there's like 7 ranges in the skill here, but everybody knows their skill rating there. So it isn't hidden like it is in the casual piece. But my question for you is, how does a player's skill rating or SR in ranked play relate to unranked players' MMR? And how does the 4x4 ranked play, player base relate to the broader COD multiplayer base, right? Am I right that it is high-end players generally graduate or choose to go into ranked play, and then they go to 4x4 versus 6x6 team deathmatch or all these other modes? They narrow it down into like 1 or 2 modes. And so I'm just trying to contextualize who the ranked player base is relative to the broader base.
Yeah, it is generally the higher skill players. And you even see this like outside of ranked play, like search and destroy in a Western audience tends to attract competitive high skill players, where in China, search and destroy is like the default mode that everybody's familiar with. It's like Counter-Strike. But in the US, it's flipped. So like TDM is the casual mode, and then search and destroy tends to have a very like subset of the more towards the high-end tail there. There is one thing I would point out though, is that it's not visible MMR. Your SR is actually based on a hidden MMR system. So they have something similar to the casual rating system. And I think they did a white paper on this too, or they've talked about it before, that your hidden rating informs your SR, but as you win or lose, then they'll just interpolate you towards that hidden rating. And so it's a similar system under the hood to casual. The only difference is as you play over time, they kind of reveal that number to you, or like it, interpolates over time. I personally am not a big fan of that approach. Like if we're going to do a rank play system, I'd like it to be more like ELO, where the number you see is what you're being match made on. So like in the current COD system, it'll match make you on that hidden number, but your visible number will give you this illusion of a journey. Contrast that to World War II. So that was the ELO system that I wrote, and then Treyarch decided to go do their own thing. The World War II ELO system was a purely visible MMR. Like what you saw next to your name was the number you were matched on, and like your opponents, that was the number that was our best guess of what their skill was. And it did increase over time. Like we did underrate players a bit, so they had room to climb, but it wasn't like an artificial journey. This was just, if you win, you earn more points and you climb up the ladder. So little bit of nuance there, but in general, like a rank play system where you have a visible MMR is pretty rare. Most systems are like COD, where they have a hidden number behind the scenes for matchmaking, and then just this cosmetic journey tacked on the front.
From online, it looked like ranked players are maybe 10 to 20% of the COD player base. In other words, a minority move up to actually engage with this, because I think you have to do like 50 matches or something before you even get into it. So I don't know if you can comment on it, but is it fair to say that it's, it probably depends on the game and the year or whatever, but is it fair to say that generally speaking, the ranked player base is roughly representing the top 10 to 20% typically of the larger COD player base, or is that not your understanding?
I think that is probably even a little high. Like I would guess it's less than that for COD. It's higher than that for some games we work with that I won't mention, or like they can talk about if they want to, but I'm not going to brag about it for them. It could be like, I haven't seen the COD data, but that ballpark, like 10 to 20% sounds about right. Like it is, I think it could even be much lower in like way back, like Black Ops 2 ranked. I mean, I think you might be 5%. When they tried to make it more of like an elite thing, like don't even come in here if you're not like hardcore, that really scared a lot of the casual players away. The other thing with ranked is that it usually launches kind of late. Like they don't have it at launch, so you've already filtered out a lot of the casual players to begin with. So it's a subset of the casual players who are still there.
That makes sense. Now, the way RP is designed, it's almost impossible to get over 20,000 on skill, although a tiny share of players seem to really grind there. And they, like I said, 10,000 plus is iridescent. But I do see scores online or some example of people pushing for a world record where they get 20 or 30,000, but it's pretty rare. and then they do a downward reset. And maybe this is related to ELO, but maybe not. But basically, depending on what tier you're in I think it's 1 through 5 or 6 tiers, you get reset to the beginning of that tier you're in. So if you're in bronze and you're near 900, you get reset to bronze 1, which is back to 0 in effect. But if you're in iridescent or the one right below it, I think it's diamond, you actually get reset down to the top of like the 3rd tier. So it's like, yeah, they get reset down to diamond 1. So crimson and iridescent, they all get reset down to diamond 1. And every season you have to go to this downward reset. So you could keep grinding past 10,000, but they basically reset you, every couple of months per season back down to that. So you've got to climb that hill all over again. And I guess, maybe it's related to ELO, but maybe there's some other reason for it. I guess my question is, why does Activision or many other games perhaps have that reset where you keep pulling down the very top tier of players? This is only the top 5% or 2% of players, 3% that get that bigger reset on skill, and then they got to grind all over again the next season. Why does that exist at all?
Well, the short answer is that the highest skill players are almost always the highest engagement players. They're going to play a lot more matches in a season than a low skill player. And I think every game I've looked at this has a pretty clear, not linear at least, not quite exponential, but your low skill players, the bronze, silver, gold, like they play a fraction of what the diamond players will play in a season. So they need a bigger reset if you're going to give them some sort of progression. The other reason they do it is because the same reason we underrate players in like World War II is you don't want to have players lose rank over time. If anything, you want to be on the low side. So if the meta switches and now they're learning new maps, they have new guns, like maybe it's not a favorable meta for them, at least you give them some room to climb up to where they belong rather than like, here's your old rank and now this season you're just getting worse. Like you don't want that experience either. So the really concise answer is simply because high skill players almost always tend to play a lot more than low skill players.
That makes sense. There was a release from Treyarch, I think around the first quarter of 2023, around Modern Warfare 2 that looked at a ranked play season. So it was just one season. And I'm curious about, if you have any sense whether this is generally true, but they had a skill breakdown for RP players. So bronze was about 18%, silver was about 34%, gold was 23.5%, platinum was 14%, diamond was about 7%, crimson was 3%, and then iridescent, including the top 250 players, was like 1% of the player base. So I don't know if this distribution fluctuates a lot or if that sounds about right. But so let me stop there. Do you think that distribution where the top 2 ranks above that 10 or 8,000, something like that, is only the top 3 or 4% of players? Do you think that bell curve, if you will, on the ranked play is pretty standard or not standard? Or does it fluctuate all over the place depending on the game and the season?
I have to see the exact curve that they have, but also from experience, almost every, at least shooter, has an asymmetric distribution. So you have a lot more bad players than you have good players. And that is also true of ranked, that there's a thin tail where you have players who are so much better than the average player, like an order of magnitude better. Like you would never outperform them, maybe like 1 in 1,000 matches or 1 in 10,000 matches. Like it's an extreme difference in skill. And so I think there probably is like a longer tail on the underlying MMR than what they show players. So they're kind of compressing that into something that's a little more, that doesn't have that extreme discrepancy where you have your highest skill player who's just like so far away from the average player that the average player is like, what's even the point of trying? So they probably shrink that, or they have some scaling rules in there with the hidden MMR. That'd be my best guess.
Well, that was one of my questions because, yeah, if that is roughly standard and you've got, these super high-end players in iridescent, and I did some very basic math looking at, again, it's over 10,000 on the skill. If we average out the iridescent share that top 1%, and estimated as roughly 12.5K on the average in that group in a given season. And then we look at Crimson, the average of that range was about 8.75K. So that's like the next 3% of players. And then you compare the skill of the top 1% to the next 3%, the gap is only about 43%. In other words, the implication is, and maybe you're saying they squish this numerically, so it's not actually accurate, but the implication is that the iridescent players in this season were only about 43% more skilled than the next 3% of players. And you could keep going and really look at how much more skilled is that top 1% player relative to the ones that are just adjacent to them. And that felt, it isn't like they're 100x more skilled. The skill, at least by the system that's exposed, nobody ever gets to 20, 30, 40,000. It's exceptionally rare. And so my question is, does it surprise you that the top 1%, at least according to this season, on average, were only about 43% more skilled than the next 3% of players in ranked play?
The 43% more skilled is kind of I'm not sure exactly what that means in this context. Like, if it's hard to say exactly there, but I'm not surprised that the tails compressed a bit, because if they're using something like the casual MMR system, that is bounded and compressed, so you can't have these extremely long tails. So that compression would be built into the underlying model. So I guess that's what I would expect, is that they don't have the full extent of those tails. But probably what you also see is that the high-level players just have to grind a lot to keep going up in skill. Like, they don't lose enough points to come back down when they lose a match. Like, they outperform their payoffs. So at the very extreme, the more they grind, the higher they climb, and you have to keep scaling down the amount of points they earn, because there's just nobody who can pull them back down. At least not unless you want to have earn 100 points for a win, but lose 2,000 points for a loss. Like, you don't want that scenario. You have to make it kind of like 100, and then maybe you lose 300. So that's kind of palatable. But if you wanted to make it so that it actually stabilized, you would have to have these extreme payoffs that players wouldn't accept.
Well, that's it. I burned through all my questions. This has been super helpful. I don't know if you have any closing comments, Greg or Charlie, but this has been super interesting to hear you dive into how these systems work. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts, but thank you so much.
Well, Charlie, we really appreciate your time today. It's been a dream to be able to talk to someone who has your level of knowledge with matchmaking and understanding how it works. So thank you so much for sharing with us what you know, what you're building in Invokation. Before we go, do you want to share us where we can find you and learn more about?
Well, it's a pleasure talking to you. Professionally, you can find me on LinkedIn, Charlie Olson, or invocation.games is our website. Do get plenty of hate mail through there, so I don't mind giving that out. But also talks a little bit more about what we do and some of our customers and case studies.
Charlie, I can't thank you enough for sharing your expertise on this. And I know I put you through a grind of 2 white papers from 2024, but you came through it like a pro. Really appreciate your comments, and I guess best of luck with the game that's launching today, I think you said, and then one next week. So maybe at a future time when you're able to, or if it gets to a point of being able to share some of the best practices you might have built into those games versus things you've done in the past, maybe we'll revisit these sort of topics. But thank you so much. Yeah,
thanks for having me. I would love to follow up once we have some hard data to look at. But we're just doing the matchmaking. The game's already live. The matchmaker's just switching over, just to be clear. So I know people are going to be scouring for what game just launched today. So
we will, when it's time to post it, we will post it. We will post everything related to Charlie as well as Invokation. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Lewis. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.